Hey guys, Jake from 8020 Media here. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to add 40 to 50 wheel horsepower to your Infiniti G35. There are two different versions of the G35. The earlier versions used the VQ35DE, which eventually got a little bit of an upgrade, and the upgraded versions are typically known as the Rev-Up engines, whereas the VQ35DE older versions are known as the non-Rev-Up engines. Now, the performance modifications for Rev-Up and non-Rev-Up engines are virtually the same. The power gains that you're going to get from them are the same as well. The only caveat is that the Rev-Up engines start with a little bit more horsepower than the non-Rev-Up engines do, and therefore are going to end with a bit more horsepower after this list of modifications. So when we look at power gains, a non-Rev-Up engine is typically going to dyno completely stock somewhere around 220 to 240 wheel horsepower, depending on the condition of the engine, whereas the Rev-Up engines will dyno right around 250 wheel horsepower. So the Rev-Up engines have a little bit of a head start, which is what's going to give them a little bit more power potential and power capability after these lists of performance modifications. There are 5 modifications on this list that can take the non-Rev-Ups to about 270 wheel horsepower and take the Rev-Up engines to about 290 wheel horsepower. Once you start looking at breaking this 270 or 290 wheel horsepower barrier, that's when we're going to have to look to forced induction. So I will touch on forced induction a little bit later in this video, but for this video we're mostly going to focus on the basic bolt-on modifications that can get you that extra 40 to 50 wheel horsepower and get you right up to those bolt-on limits without the need for forced induction. Before we jump into the list of modifications here, just one side note is typically tuning is the best thing for any engine and offers the biggest power gains, but for the VQ35, tuning isn't really a thing. There is one tuner around called UpRev Tuner, but Cobb access ports stopped supporting the G35, and there really just aren't any good plug-and-play tuning options out there. From a tuning standpoint, your only real option is to get custom dyno tuning. Any other types of tuning you're not really going to see a whole lot of benefits from. So custom dyno tuning is an option once you add all of these bolt-on modifications on this list, if you want to dial things in just a little bit further and really make sure you're maximizing power. But generally speaking, tuning's not something that I recommend if you're just looking for a little bit of additional horsepower, just because you don't see that great of gains from it. So jumping into our list of modifications for the Infiniti G35, the first one's going to be a cold air intake. An intake's going to give you about 3 to 5 wheel horsepower, and that's really just coming from sending additional air to the engine, reducing some of the restriction that you get from the factory intake system, and improving the air density a bit. In addition to these small power gains, you're also going to notice an increase in throttle response. So if you're looking for some additional power, especially since intakes are pretty affordable, an intake is definitely something that I would add to the list. My second modification really is the best modification for the G35, but it is going to be specific to the non-Rev-Ups. The Rev-Up G35's got a newer intake manifold design, so this modification isn't necessarily applicable because it doesn't add power like it does to these non-Rev-Ups. And that modification is a Plenum spacer. A Plenum spacer is going to allow you to send more air into the intake manifold. What that's going to do is improve your airflow, reducing more restriction. It's going to lower your intake air temperatures a little bit as well. And all of that will result in about 8 wheel horsepower if you have 0 other mods done to your G35. If you have some other modifications, like everything else on this list, then you can see about 15 wheel horsepower gains from a Plenum spacer modification. So the Plenum spacer mod is hands down the best modification for non-Rev-Up engines, and it's going to add the most power gains once you combine it with all of the other things on this list. Moving on, we've covered intakes and then the Plenum spacer. Those are both things to help you get more air into the engine. And then the other component of power gains for the G35 comes from the exhaust side of the house. So the next 3 things that we're going to talk about are exhaust focused. The first one's going to be headers. Headers are going to give you about 7 to 10 wheel horsepower. They'll give you better top end power. You'll have less back pressure within the exhaust system, which will help lower engine temperatures a little bit, and you'll also get a slightly deeper exhaust note out of it. The one downside to headers is that headers will actually cause a drop in mid-range torque, so you will lose about 8 wheel torque within the mid-range when you install headers, and because of that, whenever you install headers, we always recommend combining it with high flow cats or test pipes, which is the fourth modification on our list for the VQ35 Infiniti G35. Now, when I talk about high flow cats or test pipes, I'm talking about the mid pipe that sits in between the catback part of the exhaust and the headers. That's where the catalytic converter sits. So you can opt for test pipes, which is eliminating the catalytic converter, or you can get a mid pipe that has high flow catalytic converters in it, which will keep your car emissions compliant. If you go for high flow cats, you'll see around 8 to 10 wheel horsepower. If you go for test pipes, you'll likely see around 12 to 15 wheel horsepower. But the most important thing is getting back that mid-range torque that we lost from headers. And that's exactly what upgrading the mid pipe will do. You'll get back just about that 8-wheel torque. And so when you look at headers and a mid pipe combined, you'll get about 20 wheel horsepower power gains, but you're not going to see a whole lot of torque benefit because the loss from the headers is really just being picked back up from the mid pipe. But overall, two great modifications to the exhaust. And then that brings us to the last component of the exhaust, which is the catback portion of the exhaust system. Typically on most naturally aspirated vehicles, a catback exhaust does nothing but add sound, but the Infiniti G35 and the VQ35 are an exception here because they've actually proven to show pretty decent power gains just from a catback exhaust system. With the catback exhaust, you're going to be getting about 8 wheel horsepower as well as about 8 wheel torque. It's going to add a lot more sound to your car as well, but is definitely worth it just from a power gain standpoint. Guys, that covers it for our 5 modifications here. We've got 2 things on the intake side of the house, and that's a cold air intake as well as a plenum spacer. When you do both of those, you'll see about 20 wheel horsepower gains when you combine it with all of the exhaust upgrades that we talked about. And then on the exhaust side of things, that's where you'll see another 25 to 30 wheel horsepower. And so when we put all these 5 modifications together, we're going to be getting somewhere around 40 to 50 wheel horsepower on healthy engines. It might be a little bit lower, closer to 30 wheel horsepower, depending on the condition of your engine, but that right there is the recipe for adding 40 to 50 wheel horsepower to your Infiniti G35. Now, just briefly, I want to talk about turbo kits and forced induction, because if you want to push higher than the 270 wheel horsepower for non-rev-ups and 290 for rev-ups, you're going to need forced induction. Forced induction kits, more specifically turbochargers, can take the non-rev-ups to about 400 to 450 wheel horsepower and the rev-ups to 500 wheel horsepower. Anything above the 450 and 500 wheel horsepower levels, and you're going to need a built motor, as the internals just can't support that much power. So if you want to break past the 300 wheel horsepower barrier and even push into the 400s, you need forced induction. The biggest downside to forced induction, though, is that it is very expensive on these VQ35s. A full turbo kit itself is probably going to run you about $7,500, and then when you look at all of the supporting modifications that you'll need as well, you're going to be about $10,000 plus into a turbo build for a G35. It requires some pretty deep pockets and some strong will to take your G35 beyond those power levels that we discussed, but it is possible and it is an option. And if you do opt for turbocharging, you can actually add a pretty substantial amount of power to these engines before you need to start looking into internal upgrades and built motors. So they can handle a pretty decent amount of power. It's just expensive to get it there. Anyways, guys, that covers everything for our guide on the best modifications for the Infiniti G35. I hope you guys appreciate this content. If you did, click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for our future content.